In this final section of the course, we're considering the question of how society should be organized. And a principal part of the answer is how government should function. Last lecture, we discussed theoretical anarchy and the suggestion that government should not exist at all. The theoretical anarchist suggested that the laws of the state have no moral authority. And the serious anarchist suggests that we'd be better off without the government. In the state of nature, a state where each person is left to his own devices without any governmental oversight, people would learn to cooperate on their own, says the serious anarchist. Of course, such cooperation may be what led to government itself, and according to many philosophers, it's the motivation behind that cooperation that actually gives government its moral authority. This is the concept behind the social contract. The basic idea is this: government gains moral authority over its citizens because they mutually give up certain rights in exchange for the benefits that supposedly come with a lawful organized society. Of course, this usually doesn't involve a written agreement. No one signs anything, but the agreement is implicit. But since citizens would give up certain rights or powers in exchange for the benefits the government affords, they would do this, the government has the right to restrict certain rights and exercise powers over those people, over its citizens. Exactly what those benefits are and how far the government's power goes varies depending on which philosopher you talk to. And there are three major social contract theorists: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Let's talk about each in turn. According to Thomas Hobbes, citizens would mutually give up their rights to avoid the state of nature, the condition that humans would be living in without government. In his book, Leviathan, Hobbes describes the life of one living in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's a state of war where everyone is constantly threatening to steal from you or even kill you in order to survive. To avoid this condition, says Hobbes, anyone would be willing to give up the right to govern themselves to a sovereign, a king, or an assembly of men on the condition that everyone else do the same thing. So, for Hobbes, we enter into the social contract and trade our rights and autonomy for security. Now, how far does this go? How many rights do we sacrifice? What moral limit is there on how the sovereign can restrict our actions? None, says Hobbes. Whatever the sovereign does or whatever laws he passes, even if he kills you, he can do no moral wrong. Now, why did Hobbes hold this view? Well, we can explain it in a couple of ways. The philosophical argument for this is this: Hobbes is a moral relativist. He thinks there are no moral laws or natural rights in the state of nature. Actually, that's not quite right. You do have a natural right in the state of nature, but it's the natural right to survival, to do whatever you need to survive, to kill, steal, lie, cheat. It's all morally acceptable in the state of nature according to Hobbes. And it's morally acceptable for your neighbor to steal from or kill you to survive. In fact, it's this natural right that motivates you to enter into the social contract. You realize that it is in your best interest, that is the best way to ensure your own survival. Moral obligations to others are only created once one enters into the social contract. When you promise to obey the sovereign and the sovereign orders you to not harm others, then you're morally obligated to not harm others. Really, ultimately, the only moral obligation you have is to obey the sovereign. This is why the sovereign can do no wrong. He can't break a promise. He didn't make one. You promised him. So if you think you're being mistreated by the sovereign, again, even if the sovereign kills you, too bad. Whatever way the sovereign treats his subjects, whatever laws he passes, Hobbes says, is a matter between him and God. His subjects are obligated to obey. Unless he makes you kill yourself, he's not even violating your natural rights. And so, Hobbes argues, and this is key for him, rebellion against the sovereign, never justified. Never. No matter how bad the sovereign treats you, the state of nature is worse. And so submission to the authority of the sovereign is preferable. It's paramount. For Hobbes, there is no greater sin than to question the authority of the sovereign and rebel and thus threaten a return to the state of nature. But Hobbes also had non-philosophical reasons for endorsing this view, for thinking the sovereign could do no wrong. For example, he was the tutor of King Charles II. His close relationship to the English monarchy and the power they had over him likely played at least some role in him adopting the position that the sovereign could do no wrong. After all, even though the sovereign was not necessarily the King of England, like the word sovereign in his works doesn't necessarily refer to the King of England. It could be any person or group that the people turned over their rights to. The King of England was the sovereign for the vast majority of Hobbes' reading audience. But likely more influential on Hobbes' writing was the political turmoil that he witnessed, namely the English Civil War of the mid-1600s, a time when religions were always at each other's throats in a struggle for political power. Because being loyal to the monarchy was just too dangerous at the time, Hobbes fled to Paris in 1640. He even burned some of his works so they couldn't be used against him. 2 years before Hobbes published his arguments in Leviathan in 1651, a death warrant for King Charles I was signed by the Puritan Oliver Cromwell, and that order was carried out that same year. So you can understand, given his loyalty to the king, why Hobbes wanted to say that all rebellions, like Cromwell's, were illegitimate. In fact, for Hobbes, the English Civil War revealed what the state of nature was really like and why he really wanted to avoid it. He really did fear for his life most of the time. And whatever the monarch had to do to rectify that situation, for Hobbes, was justified. For Hobbes, life is fear. And since it's a choice between fearing the sovereign or fearing the state of nature, you should choose fearing the sovereign because the state of nature is worse. This is why the sovereign is morally permitted to do whatever he has to guard his subjects against the state of nature. Now, interestingly, since the majority of the turmoil he witnessed, that Hobbes witnessed, was caused by religious disagreements, one thing, according to Hobbes, that the sovereign should do to guard against it is establish a state religion. Religious freedom, according to Hobbes, was dangerous. It led to religious factions, which led to bloody rebellions. Ultimately, it didn't matter which religion. In England, it happened to be Anglicanism. But whatever it is, the sovereign needs to head up a religion and make everyone stick to it to keep religious factions from fighting over political power. Now, obviously, not very many people agreed with Hobbes. The 1600s and the 1700s saw many political revolutions, which Hobbes said were illegitimate, including the one that founded America. In England, Oliver Cromwell's Puritan alternative to the English monarchy, the Protectorate, lasted less than a decade. It degenerated quite quickly into a militaristic state that basically lost power once Cromwell died. The power vacuum left by Cromwell's death made England a particularly violent and dangerous place to live, and this led to the throne being offered to King Charles's son, Charles II, who took power in 1660. But when the king's brother James, a professed Catholic, took the throne a short time later, another revolution, the Glorious Revolution, was imminent. James' Catholicism just couldn't be tolerated. In a near bloodless coup, the Parliament voted to offer the throne to the Dutch William of Orange and his wife Mary, whose Protestantism was much more in line with English Anglicanism. They accepted and began ruling in 1689. It was these events that our second defender of the social contract, the philosopher John Locke, witnessed in his younger years. Many even consider his most famous work, Two Treatises of Government, as a defense of the Glorious Revolution, although it was most likely written before the Glorious Revolution. Locke's work remains one of the most important and influential works in all of political philosophy, especially because it suggested that rebellion against the state could be justified. According to Locke, the sovereign can do wrong by violating our natural rights to life, liberty, and property that all citizens have. Now, Locke was a little bit more optimistic about human nature than Hobbes. In general, even in the state of nature, Locke thought people are able to keep from killing, raping, and pillaging at every opportunity. But it's still a worry. Someone always could, without consequence in the state of nature, come in and steal your land and goods, force you into servitude, or even take your life. And it is for protection against such rights violations that humans enter into the social contract and submit to the rule of the sovereign, according to Locke. Although he can't guarantee that such violations never happen, he can reduce the likelihood by attaching consequences to them, like jail. And since, unlike Hobbes, Locke thinks we have a natural right to such things, if the sovereign fails to protect them or violates these rights, then rebellion is justified. Locke is famous for his labor view of property, that someone comes to own something when they mix their labor with it. If you pick an apple off a wild tree, it's your apple. If you cultivate land to grow food, both the land and the food is yours. But if you take an apple off a tree someone else planted on their land, you're violating their right to property. And so if the government starts seizing your farmland, it's violating your natural right to property. Locke has similar problems with the government forcing you to do specific labor or to put your life at risk. That would violate your natural right to life and liberty. Now, this might make you think that Locke opposes taxes and state-led warfare. After all, what is taxation other than the acquisition of your property? What does the government do when it drafts you into the military other than force you to put your life at risk? But such things are not a violation of your rights if they are done with your consent. And, Locke argues, when you enter into the social contract and thus create a government, you consent to give up your rights to an extent, the extent necessary to keep government existing and functioning. But who decides how much taxation is necessary to keep the state running? Who decides when fighting a war is necessary, when a foreign power is enough of a threat to make the non-existence of the state a possibility, so it needs protection? The people do, or at least the majority does. Or perhaps we might say the representatives that the majority elects. Regardless, consent is important for Locke. If the majority does deem war necessary, then you may get drafted and you don't have the right to rebel as a result. That's part of the social contract. But if the government violates the consent of the majority, then rebellion is justified. If the government doesn't give the people the chance to consent, say by not offering them representation in the government, then rebellion is justified. So now we can start to see that even though he was writing in relation to the English political revolutions of the 1600s, Locke helped inspire the American Revolution of the 1700s. No taxation without representation was a rallying cry. The fact that the King of England taxed the American colonies without giving them a voice in the government was seen as justification for revolution. It was a violation of their Lockean natural rights to life, liberty, and property. In fact, it seems that the Founding Fathers borrowed from Locke when they insisted in the Declaration of Independence that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were inalienable rights. And that's not all they borrowed from Locke. Like Hobbes, Locke also recognized the danger posed by the struggle of religious factions fighting for political power. But in A Letter Concerning Toleration, instead of trying to solve this problem by having the state impose one single religion on everyone, as Hobbes suggested, Locke suggested avoiding such a mandate and making religious devotion a matter of private conscience. If no religion is in charge of the government, then religions can't fight about which religion should be in charge. In fact, the thesis of the first of Locke's two treatises was that political power does not come from God, but instead comes from the consent of the governed. Not only did this make things like the Glorious Revolution possible, it's difficult to throw out a king when people think that he's appointed by God, but it separated religion from government. This notion, the separation of church and state, was new and likely played a role in the American founding fathers later demanding in Article 6, paragraph 3 of the Constitution that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And adding to the Constitution the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Locke wasn't the only philosopher to influence the founding fathers. And that brings us to our third social contract theorist, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was born in the city-state of Geneva, and perhaps his biggest influence on the founders was his defense of its democratic rule. At the time, it was common to decry democracy and think that the general populace was incapable of governing itself. After all, at the time, most people were illiterate and uneducated. Only the educated elite with their understanding of political philosophy were generally thought to be capable of bearing the responsibility of running the government and passing laws. But Rousseau thought the general populace was more capable. When left to its own devices, the majority will agree on what is most in the public interest. What Rousseau somewhat confusingly called the general will, but what we can call the common good. To be clear, the general will or common good is not what society thinks is good, but what actually is best for society as a whole. For Rousseau, the elite aren't apt at governing. They're simply good at manipulating the public. If the population is free of such manipulation, the common consensus, or what the majority thinks, will actually align with the common good, what actually is good for society. Interestingly, Rousseau thought political parties were a primary source of such manipulation, and so he called for their abolition. He also wasn't much of a fan of representative democracy. He said it made slaves of people every other day of the year except election day. He wanted the kind of democracy talked about in Plato's Republic, a direct democracy where everybody has one vote. Rousseau's confidence in the common man extended to his view of the state of nature as well, which he thought was rather nice. The noble savages in the state of nature, Rousseau thought, would most likely live in relative isolation and not really compete with each other. The competitive nature Hobbes saw in people, which Hobbes thought would make the state of nature so horrible, well, Rousseau argued that that was actually something that civilization, with its money-based economy, had done to people. Take that away, and people would just be peaceful and content. But for Rousseau, the best thing about the state of nature is that within it, humans are truly free, with no government, laws, or sovereign to make them unfree. As Rousseau begins his most famous work, The Social Contract, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. But despite his love for it, Rousseau wasn't naive enough to think that it was actually possible to return to the state of nature, regardless of whether we actually were in that state. Rousseau's aim was to show how we could have the kind of freedom we would enjoy in the state of nature within the bounds of modern society. To accomplish this, Rousseau suggested a direct democracy in which the general public would decide by majority vote what should be the law of the land. Since each voter, Rousseau argued, will be subject to the laws that are passed, the chances for abuse are greatly reduced. And since it's the republic itself that is choosing the laws, as long as it's free of manipulation, the laws it chooses will align with what's best for the republic, but is what's in the common good. What is the common good? The republic will not pass laws that favor, say, the rich or the elite or the monarch or whoever might have power. Now, that's not to say that there would be no such persons or no such form of government. Although the general population must be what passes the laws, it cannot always enforce them. So, depending on factors like population size, monarchy, aristocracy, or some other form of government might be necessary. But for Rousseau, it must play only an executive role, executes the laws. The real power, the power to make laws, always rested with the people for Rousseau. Now, one thing here is important to realize. Americans tend to think that government is kind of a one and done deal. If you get it right the first time, there's no need for further change or revolt. Saying the American system of government is anything but perfect is sometimes tantamount to treason. But for many important political thinkers like Rousseau, government is something that goes rotten like food. You have to keep replacing it. A government will inevitably concentrate its power until it's able to usurp the will of the people. And then when it does, the people must replace it. In fact, like Thomas Jefferson, Rousseau thought revolutions to overthrow the government and return power to the people would be needed quite often, perhaps even once every generation. Now, perhaps modern democracies have proved Rousseau wrong. Term limits and an amendable constitution have made the need for revolution unnecessary. Then again, the fact that we have term limits and an amendable constitution may prove his point. We might think of every election in which there is a major change in power as a bloodless revolution. Indeed, when the Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson took power, it was called the Revolution of 1800. But perhaps term limits and amendable constitutions are simply prolonging the inevitable. After all, we've already had one civil war. Might another that dissolves our government entirely be inevitable? Could our form of government really last indefinitely? And that brings us back around to Rousseau's other great influence on the Founding Fathers, his emphasis on freedom. While they ignored his advice regarding representative democracy and political parties, they, like all major political thinkers after Rousseau, did emphasize the need for a government to guarantee the freedom of its citizens. But it's important to note that Rousseau's idea of freedom is different from the one you may have in your head right now. For one thing, we aren't talking about metaphysical freedom, whether we're free in that sense cannot be affected by what government we find ourselves under. We're talking about political freedom. But even the concept of political freedom you have in mind may differ from Rousseau's. Rousseau's sense of political freedom is akin to the compatibilist notion of freedom that we've talked about before. It's not the freedom to do otherwise or to not be coerced or controlled by outside powers. It's a freedom to act in accordance with oneself, one's wants and desires or rational deliberation. And just as our first order, and not just our first order desires, right, but our second order desires, our overarching or meta desires that dictate what we really want to do or represent the kind of person that we really truly want to be. And Rousseau suggests each person must truly desire to do that which aligns with the common good. That's what they really want. If they act otherwise, putting their own good above that of the community, then they are not really acting freely. Their actions are not aligning with their true self. And since freedom is so important, Rousseau suggests that such a person must be, quote, forced to be free. If you act in accordance against the common good, you must be forced to be free. Now, how might that work? In his course, The Modern Political Tradition, Hobbes to Habermas, Lawrence Cahoon offers the example of a rich drug addict who faces no obstacles to attaining what he wants, his drug of choice, let's say Walter White's blue crystal meth. We wouldn't say the rich drug addict is free, even though he can do what he wants, because he's a slave to the blue. His true self doesn't want to be dependent on the drug. So we can force him to be free, in the Rousseauian sense, by cutting off his supply and thereby limiting his freedom in one sense, restricting his abilities, and thus forcing him to break his habit. By doing so, we would be setting him free in the Rousseauian sense, enabling him to pursue his true goals in life. Rousseau thinks the same of the person who acts contrary to the common good. One's true goals align with the common good. If one acts contrary to it, we must stage an intervention and free him from whatever wants and desires are keeping him from seeking it. To benefit the Republic must be what his true self wants, and only in that way can he be truly free. Cahoon suggests that this notion of freedom makes Rousseau's philosophy a bit dangerous, and I would agree. For example, it seems that Rousseau would find acceptable the following situation. Suppose a foreign power is invading and the vast majority votes to go to war to protect the Republic. So clearly, fighting in the war aligns with the common good. A draft is thus instituted. But a pacifist, conscientious objector decides to try to dodge the draft and not fight, but then he's caught. In line with Rousseau, it would seem perfectly acceptable for him to be brainwashed so as to give up his pacifist tendencies and see the war as justified, so that he will then gladly lay down his life for the Republic. In such a way, he is forced to be free. He is freed from his wants and desires that were keeping him from acting in accordance with the common good, and forced to act on his true desire to benefit the Republic. Now, that likely does not align with what you'd imagine a free republic to be. One where individuals are forced to act in the interest of the common good doesn't sound very free to us. But that's because a more libertarian, free to do otherwise, or free from encumbrances conception of freedom dominates Western thought. Those in Rousseau's ideal society would be free in the Rousseauian sense, just not always in the Western libertarian sense. But according to Rousseau, this is perfectly justified and moral. For Rousseau, each citizen in the Republic who enters into the social contract gives up all of their rights to the Republic. It follows that no individual's rights can stand in opposition to the Republic. The good of the Republic for Rousseau always takes precedence. So, although he did influence the founding fathers, Rousseau was actually more of a precursor to socialism and communism. But his answer to the question of this lecture is the same as that of Hobbes and Locke. What justifies a government? The people under it entering into a social contract. It's just that Rousseau saw the motivation for doing so a bit differently. For Hobbes, people entered into the social contract for security, to avoid the horrors of the state of nature. For Locke, it was the protection of life, liberty, and property. And for Rousseau, people entered the social contract to guarantee their freedom, as he conceived of it. But even if the government is justified by a social contract, many questions still remain. Does the role of the government extend beyond security or the protection of rights? How big exactly should the government be? How much, if at all, should it interfere in or regulate the economy? Entering the social contract necessarily limits our rights or our liberty, but how far should those limits go? What kind of action should or should not be prohibited by the state? Is the government supposed to guarantee justice? Is it supposed to try to make society fair? And what might such a society look like? It is to these questions that we shall turn in the next lectures, starting with how big should government be?